Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. Hope that you're all having a wonderful week, a wonderful Wednesday. Today is Wednesday, September 16th. I know for me, I'm not necessarily having the greatest week, so I thought we would just slow it down a little bit, keep it a bit relaxed, because I still want to talk about movies, still want to have some fun, and that's what we're going to try and do today. So I don't really have a theme for today, like the past couple weeks have been. I've been a little bit lax on the theme, trying to come up with the movies that I'm watching. But we do have a word today, and that's the word drive. The word drive is going to appear in all three of the movies, so they might not be thematically linked, but at least we have a bit of a through line. So the first movie that I'm watching is called Driveways. It's a newer indie film from 2020. Then my weekly watch is a much anticipated movie for me, one that I have neglected to check out for a very long time, but have always been very curious about, called Drive. It's the word of the day, and it stars Ryan Gosling. And then finally, we talked about him last week for my weekly recommendation, so I figured we would stick with that trend. And so this one is Edgar Wright's most recent film, Baby Driver. And then make sure you stay tuned until the very end of the episode, because I'm going to be talking about my top 5 road trip movies of all time, given... No, I guess there is kind of a theme, right? A word's a theme. The movies are going to be pretty different from each other, but we do have a little bit of something. So, given the theme, I thought road trip movies would be fun to talk about. But that's today's episode, so let's get started. All right, so Driveways was released May 7th, 2020. I did not get the chance to check it out until now, and I am very glad that I did, because this is a movie that I liked quite a bit. And the movie follows Cody, who's a young kid, and his single mother, Kathy, as they go to clean out his aunt's house, who has recently passed away, and he starts to form a bond with an older veteran gentleman next door. So that's kind of the basic theme of the movie, or basic premise of the movie. This is one of those movies where not a whole lot happens, narratively speaking. It's one of those kind of like slow burn movies, which I guess that's kind of a theme for today, maybe at least with the first two movies, but this one definitely takes a little bit to get into it, and there aren't a lot of narrative beats, narrative developments, but there is a lot of character development. It's pretty much all character work, which is the type of movie that I very much enjoy. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but it really just kind of shows the purity of filmmaking, and it shows a lot of the nuances of human connection, and I think this one does that really expertly. I adored this movie. I think I had a huge grin on my face for the last 45 minutes, because not everything in this movie is happy. In fact, a lot of it is very melancholy. That's kind of the main word to describe really every aspect of the film. But there are just moments between characters that lighten your spirit. I know there are points, particularly from Cody's perspective, where he would interact with certain people and they would respond to things that he would do, or he would do specific things that definitely made me feel very warm inside. And so a lot of that, let's start with the actual critiques, shall we? So a lot of that comes down to the acting. I think the performances are brilliant in this. I really have not seen, at least this year, because I like to kind of compare movies year to year and make a running list. So this year, these are by far the realest performances I've seen yet. And what's great is that it's not just from one person. So it is from Cody's perspective, but I would have to say that Kathy, the mother, played by Hong Chow, and Del, the veteran, played by Brian Dennehy, the late Brian Dennehy, carry almost just as much of this movie. And Lucas J, I want to credit the actor as the one who plays Cody because he does an amazing job. But I would say that the emotional weight of the movie and much of the dialogue and much of just the individual scenes kind of come down to like 50% Cody and then 50% Kathy and Del. And Cody is oftentimes in the scenes with Kathy and Del, even if they are sort of the centerpiece, or at least the person who we're supposed to be resonating with in that scene. So all three of them kind of function in a sort of family ensemble. And in that sense, I think they bring out the best performances in each other, along with the directing, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I think the performances between the three of them work excellently in tandem with each other. But I also think there's some really nice performances from some of those side characters. So there's not really many instances where we have side characters. We've got a couple different, we've got like two pairs of kids at certain points, and I thought both of those were very charming, very nostalgic. And then we also have a couple other adults that we get to interact with. There's a neighbor in particular who definitely is fairly memorable to me. And so I think all of those performances add a lot of character, and they add literal characters for one, but I think they just add some meat to this film and make this world feel very lived in. Feels like it's not just the world of the movie. It really feels like this is just kind of a window into something that is real ultimately because of how genuine these performances are. I really can't stress that enough. I know that a performance is good for me, or I'll phrase this a little bit differently. When I'm thinking in my head, this is a great performance, this is really good, it is. I'm probably right. I would hope to think that my instincts are correct. But if I'm thinking that during the movie, it's kind of pulling me out. It's not really as genuine a performance. So it's good. It can be good. It can show a lot of range, but it might not be the best. It probably doesn't fit in the world of the film or doesn't feel real. Something is taking me out of it. But here, I don't think there was a single time that I thought to myself, these are great performances, because it really felt like I was seeing these people. I think it helps that I was not really familiar with any of the actors in this movie, but specifically Cody, Lucas J, I just felt everything with him. I really kind of understood his character. I think he's a character that many people can relate to if you have gone through any sort of social isolation or loss. It's really just a universal thing that he goes through, and just a lot of different things that he goes through. And so does Kathy and Del. I think another big part of this film is this is one of Brian Dennehy's final performances. The film was released May 7th. He passed away tragically on April 15th. And so this film, in a way, kind of feels like a goodbye to him. This is not going to be the last performance we see him in. There are some other films that he also filmed before his passing. But this one is really all about growth and moving on and meeting people in your life that may not be in your life forever. And that's something that Cody has to come to terms with, but it's also something that his character Del has to come to terms with. And there's more or less a monologue at the end of this film that is sort of a goodbye, or at least some sort of a processing of grief and moving on, whether it be an actual loss or moving locations, which is kind of the case for this film. So it really feels like we get to sit with his performance and actually get sort of this meta thing going on that the director never intended for with this actor that really heightens the performance. But it's really not a performance that needs heightening. I think everybody in this movie has a really, I don't even want to give it an adjective because of just how real it feels, because there's also not only moments where we get some really poignant dialogue, but there's also some great uses of no dialogue in this movie. For the first 20 minutes, there's very little dialogue, and then throughout the movie, it's really efficient in its storytelling by focusing mainly on how characters are reacting to things. And in that sense, we get some really vulnerable performances from these actors. We can really tell what they're going through and understand their inner monologue. And then when they interact with other characters, I feel like we get the ups and downs of an actual conversation and actual kind of human interaction by seeing the moments where they are vulnerable and then seeing the moments where they are much more guarded because we've gotten to see them both alone and with people. And I think that part really resonated with me because it almost feels out of place when these characters, this is kind of acting and writing now, we're kind of bleeding into the screenplay, but I thought that some of the moments where the actors were really vulnerable, sorry, a little bit of a tongue twister there, the moments where these characters were vulnerable with each other felt almost out of place. It felt like, hey, we're talking about this thing that's much more casual, and now suddenly here's this big emotional baggage moment. It happens a couple times that I can really remember, but then, and they kind of like linger on it for a long time, and it's mostly a character monologue. There's not a lot of interjections from another character when that first character opens up. But that's kind of how that happens in real life. You're really guarded socially a lot of times, or at least you're kind of sticking to those social scripts. And then when the guard comes down, your guard comes down, and it almost feels unexpected, but it's because you're comfortable with somebody, and now we've become really comfortable with these characters, so that's kind of okay to do. And it's not really building backstory for the sake of having an interesting backstory. It really feels like this is the moment the characters need to open up to each other to keep the story going. So I thought that was a really great use of kind of holding back on dialogue early on in the film and then releasing it kind of all at once, because that feels very realistic to what human interaction actually is. And from a story standpoint with the screenplay, all of the development with these characters is so strong and so emotional. I mean, Cody is kind of the backbone of this movie, and he goes through a fantastic arc. I don't want to kind of spoil what that arc is, but he starts the movie off as a very secluded, lonely kid, in a sense, a little bit of a social outcast. There are some things that he can't handle yet at his age or at his development, and so getting to see him overcome some of those things and then or coming to terms with some of those other things, I think is really powerful. He has an emotional outburst towards the end of the movie that then kind of culminates in a really beautiful shot with him and Dell, and it kind of exemplifies what the end of his arc is about him growing. And I had a very visceral response to that. So I think this is a really emotional film, and a lot of that comes down to the screenplay, because it's, I mean, I mentioned this word earlier, but there's really no other way to describe it other than melancholy. It kind of has this sting to it where nothing in it is overtly really sad or really depressing, but there's so many different just kind of human emotions and things that all of us have gone through that are either hinted at or not, or kind of skirted around, not really talked about, but are very much a presence in this movie, that it just feels like there's this weight over all of these characters and then, in a sense, the audience. It reminds me of a ghost story. I've talked about that once or twice on the podcast. If you have seen that film, that's really kind of about like what memories and what a place can do to you, and how that affects you growing up, and then how that affects you like once you've quote unquote grown up. And so I think there's kind of a lot of different little nuances in the film that are not really touched upon, but really add the emotional core of the movie. And along with those nuances, there's a lot of things in the film that are implied that are not actually talked about, which is kind of the telltale sign of a good script. Because I can tell that this script went through lots and lots of revisions and drafts, or at least, if my ears are correct, it did, because there are so many things that are not told to the audience. It really trusts its audience in understanding the things that need to be understood, or questioning the things that are not going to be told to you. So there are things that, whether it be somebody's backstory that's a name that we don't know, or something that might have happened that we're never going to find out, there's definitely kind of this ongoing thread of what Cody is going through. It's hinted at that he might be on the autism spectrum or have a mild case of ADHD, but that's not something that is told to us, and it's really not necessary if it was told to us. So I like how that's not something that's explicitly stated, because it also might not be something that the characters know. There's also a lot that goes on with Dell as a character, where we don't really know his backstory until very late in the film, and we don't know the relationship that he has with certain people, but you can tell that a lot of these relationships kind of weigh on him. So there's so much that's hinted at here that's implied, and so the fact that it really trusts its audience, I think, made it aware to me how well written of a script this is. And the production design is very similar. There's a lot of production design here. So when they go to clean out his aunt's house, it is made very clear that his aunt was also going through something and was a hoarder, has a lot of material things in her house. But we never spend any time on the things in her house because ultimately it's unimportant. So the unsung hero of this film is the production design or the set production designer, set dresser, anybody who is involved in that, because there's so much stuff here that probably has a lot of symbolism that we really don't get to see. And ultimately, I like that we don't get to see because it's not something that is really all that necessary. So it doesn't linger on any of it, but you still feel the entirety of the production design within the movie. And then the cinematography kind of lends itself to that too. It does a lot of showing by not showing. It shows a lot of very small, intimate moments. I like to kind of view this as very quiet cinematography, very individual shots of a door frame or, I mean, maybe a doorknob. I guess it's hard to just show a door frame without showing the door, or a window or a tree, or a countertop. It's all of these small things that show you what the world is like. And I like how it's kind of setting up that it's showing what the world is like from Cody's perspective. A lot of it is from a lower angle or something that is at the eye line of where a kid might be. And so the cinematography that doesn't draw attention to itself, but through kind of the visuals and the editing, it really creates how whole this story is really beautiful. And much like the script, very symbolic and also very efficient. And then I also think my favorite aspect of the cinematography is how many frames within frames there are. So this is a very common device that's used in a lot of movies where if a character is framed within a window or framed within a door frame, and so you can tell a very clear set of borders within the frame and a character is within that. It's usually something with a character being trapped emotionally, maybe even physically, but stuck in some way or the other. And that's very often in the movie, but I also think that it's used as a framing device in this, or at least this is how I interpreted it. I don't know if this was the intention, but this movie really feels like a window into just somebody, like a real person's world. If somebody told me this was a documentary, I would have believed you. And so the fact that there are all these frames within the frames makes me feel like that's what the movie's trying to be. It's trying to just be a little bit of a window into the world of somebody that's going through something that we probably will never know, but can also really empathize with, because it's also a very common thing said that the specific is the universal, which definitely pervades here. So I like how that framing device is used both to show the emotional turmoil of the characters, but also to kind of be a little bit of a meta commentary about the movie, or at least that's kind of how I saw it. The editing is also kind of quiet in the same way that the cinematography is. I wrote this down in my notes as sort of, it's like slow, fast editing, because the scenes are very slow. The pacing is very methodical, and it really just kind of lets moments linger, and the scenes kind of last for a very long time, but going in between scenes is very quick, because the editing is usually those small shots of things that we get to see what the world is. It's not like one establishing shot that is much slower. It's like a lot of these, even though the cuts aren't that quick, it's just like these are very specific things that are being shown to us. So the scenes are very slow, but then going in between scenes are a bit faster. And then also the scenes kind of end almost abruptly. It's like, all right, conversation's over, here we go. It's not going to like overstay its welcome in any way. So that's why it's kind of like fast and slow. And I think the pacing between scenes and with all the scene work works really well. And then obviously the score here is gorgeous. It's really this very simple violin score that adds that sort of nostalgic with a tinge of sadness feel to it, and so it also really sets the tone for the movie. The beginning of the film is those quick shots that are very stagnant and very specific, paired with this violin score, which makes you very aware of what the tone of this movie is going to be, and it kind of persists throughout the entire thing. So then we're going to move on to the directing. We're going to finish this review up. It's directed by Andrew Ahn, and I have not seen any others of his work, but this film shows off the time and the care that he took to tell a story like this that is just so powerful with how small it is. It feels so large for these characters, but ultimately the stakes are very low. There's nothing that really happens in the movie. That's what it feels like, because that's what it is to be a person. So there's just so much empathy that's kind of like fed into the entire movie. And then I just think that he has a really solid bond with the audience. He knows the story that he's trying to tell, and he trusts that the audience is going to get that. And he also trusts that based on his filmmaking, the audience is going to have some form of empathy for pretty much every character in it. So I really adored this movie. I think it just has so much to say with how little it really says. And there's just so much to get out of it. I think it's a really nice movie to kind of calm down, relax to really think about. So if that's what you're in the mood for, I highly recommend this one. I'm going to give this one a strong 9 out of 10. And I think it's maybe a bit premature, but I think this might be my favorite film of 2020. I know there's a couple movies up there that I've already reviewed. On a Magical Night, Boys State, The Invisible Man. I think all of those are pretty high, but it's been a little bit of a lackluster movie year just with everything going on and the things getting pushed from release. There hasn't been too much, so I think that this one is a very strong contender for number 1 of 2020. So if you're interested in that, I can highly recommend it to you. All right, so that's Driveways. Next up is a very, very different film, but my weekly watch is Drive. And then my weekly recommendation is Baby Driver, and make sure you stick around until the very end of the episode where I talk about my top 5 road trip movies of all time. But right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review of Driveways. I'm now going to be talking about my weekly watch, which was Drive, and finally my weekly recommendation of Baby Driver. And make sure you stick around until the very end of the episode where I talk about my top 5 road trip movies of all time. But right now, we're talking about Drive. This is a movie that I've been wanting to watch for such a long time. There are certain movies that if you intend on going to film school, I would recommend you to watch, because otherwise they will probably get spoiled for you, and this is one of them. I didn't get it spoiled for me, luckily, but there were multiple instances where people would be doing projects and like have a scene from it that I then knew that scene, or talk about it in a paper they might be presenting, or maybe an influence for a film they're presenting or screening. So I've seen a good amount about this one. Luckily, there was one where I think they were going to talk about the spoiler, or like a couple, maybe 1 or 2 spoilers from this movie, but it was an online Zoom session from last semester, so I just muted that and did not pay attention because I wanted to see this movie for myself, and I'm glad I did, because I did enjoy this very much. I don't think I enjoyed it quite as much as everybody else does. It's talked about all the time, both in film school or just like in film discussions, maybe on YouTube or Twitter. So there's a lot of analysis on this film already. Because of that, it's held in very high regard. I just don't think that I resonated with it quite as much, but I still enjoy it quite a bit. So don't let that make you think that I don't like the movie, because I really do. But let's talk about what it is. So Baby Driver. I'm not doing Baby Driver yet. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. This one's Drive. They are actually fairly similar. We'll talk about them a little bit. So Drive is directed by Nicholas Winding Refn. It stars Ryan Gosling, Carey Mulligan, along with a slew of other actors. Like, let's see, we got Bryan Cranston, Albert Brooks, Ron Perlman, Oscar Isaac. Yeah, we got lots. Christina Hendricks. We got plenty in this movie, so the performances are on point. They are very good in the movie, but basically follows Ryan Gosling, who his character's not named. He's only known as Driver, And Driver is a getaway driver in Los Angeles, or I don't think it's ever said. It seems like it's Los Angeles, though. It's pretty clear. And he starts up a romance or somewhat of a romance, a hinted at romance with one of his neighbors, and then who he does not want to get involved in the underworld that he is a part of, and then shenanigans ensue. Lots of violence. No, but this movie starts out actually pretty quiet. In that way, I think it is somewhat similar to Driveways. There's a lot of very human moments that linger on certain things, and the performances in that way are also very muted. So Ryan Gosling is fantastic in this movie, and it starts out where he does not have a lot to do. He doesn't do much. It doesn't seem like very much of a stretch. And really, through the whole thing, it doesn't seem like there's all that much of a stretch other than some of that obviously like internal acting that you're going to have to project. So in that way, it's very good, but there's not a lot that he has to do on the surface. So it's really fascinating to see his character go through the evolution of starting to open up throughout the movie, because the beginning of the movie, he has just a very kind of like laid back persona, but he has also just a very menacing look to him. He just seems very like intimidating. He has a very strong stage presence, which an actor like Ryan Gosling is going to give you. He's been in the industry for very long, so he actually commands the screen in a way that he doesn't have to fill much of it, and he doesn't have to say anything, and you really feel like he's taking charge of that scene. So his performance is very commanding. It really gets a sense that he's kind of the leader of this film. He's what this film is about. It's going to follow him, and he portrays that in his performance. I also really like Carey Mulligan, who has a very similar muted performance because she's gone through certain hardships and emotional turmoil that we don't really know if Driver has gone through, because we don't really get a lot of insight into his backstory, but we do have a little bit more information on what she has gone through. And so seeing her laid back performance, I guess dulled back isn't really a word, so her laid back performance in the same way, it's very similar to Ryan Gosling. It complements it really well, but she kind of has to open up earlier. She's a bit warmer than he is, and so establishing that really early, how they're a great complement for each other, but then are also just on varying degrees of what they're willing to give to one another, really creates some great chemistry. This kind of goes into the cinematography and the directing, so this is bleeding a little bit further into the review, but the looks in this movie are so prolonged and specific that you can't help but be drawn to them, to the performance, to the romance, to that chemistry. So there's a couple different instances, actually there's a good amount of instances where the characters, particularly Ryan Gosling and Carey Mulligan, but actually lots of different characters will share this, where they'll be looking at each other, whether it be lovingly or distastefully or whatnot, and the camera holds on that for uncomfortably long, so like they're holding this gaze longer than probably any other person would. It's probably not realistic that this would be happening, but it really creates this sense of character, and the performances stick in a way that it doesn't feel unnatural. So I think that's the thing that stands out the most to me with the acting. I really loved that aspect of it. And starting out so quiet and subdued that by the time we get to this much more aggressive kind of second and third act, I guess primarily third act, but towards the end of the second. So the finale of the movie feels way more jarring, and because Ryan Gosling is really not saying much, but he still has that commanding presence, even when he's in a seemingly loving romantic relationship, the aggression doesn't come out of nowhere. It does really make sense here, and adds layers and layers of depth to his character. So I think there's just a lot kind of piled on here. So even though it doesn't look like Ryan Gosling or anybody else is doing a lot, they really are. I also I think my two favorite performances other than those main two are Bryan Cranston and Oscar Isaac. I think Oscar Isaac has a pretty small role in this movie, but what I like about his performance is that he also commands the screen, but the way that it's framed and the way that he says certain lines, it's much more negative. So Ryan Gosling, it seems like he's sort of this somewhat positive, I guess, commanding presence, but Oscar Isaac is much more judgmental, and it seems like we should be on edge about him. And a lot of that is how the story is framed, for sure, but I like sort of that they're foils for each other in a way. So in a way that Ryan Gosling and Carey Mulligan are kind of foils for each other, but in this romantic relationship and complement each other really well. It's much more clear with Oscar Isaac that they're sort of protagonist and antagonist in just this individual relationship, even though Oscar Isaac isn't the primary antagonist of the movie. And then I also like Bryan Cranston because he's the most different in the movie. So everybody is either really subdued or very menacing, very violent. Whereas Bryan Cranston, it's a very different role for him, which I think is also something that stands out to me because there's a little bit of extra textual things going on with the fact that he is not like a lot of his other characters, but he has kind of this very welcoming persona, and a lot of it comes down to his hand gestures, a lot of what he does non-verbally, which is what a lot of the actors do really excellently in the movie. So I loved his performance. I think he was probably not my favorite character because I just don't see him all that much, but definitely one of the most interesting and one of my favorites to watch. Then the screenplay. So this is actually a very simple movie. So it's basically just a getaway driver who gets wrapped up in sort of this mob plot involving some of the other people in the story, and he doesn't want to get the woman that he has grown to love and her son involved, and so he needs to protect them. So there's really not that much that goes on, and it's much more about how it's shown. I do think that the ways in which the story is connected with each other, so there are characters that are established in the beginning that really don't come into the major plot, or at least sort of the like violent sort of mob based plot until the end of the movie. So all those are connected really nicely. There's some really shocking moments. So I'd seen one movie from this director, and he's not known for it, but he definitely does these moments of very graphic violence. So I was kind of expecting that going in, and I knew that there was some heavier material in this, some more mature moments. So I was kind of expecting that. And so when it didn't come very early, I was like, oh, maybe that's not the kind of movie that this is. So then when it does come, it's much more shocking. So even if you know what you're getting yourself into, having those really shocking moments with how the beginning is established actually still works really, really well. I think my one question for the screenplay, and this is not something that's like accusing the director or anybody involved, because I just watched this movie, so I haven't been able to process it yet in the same way that I would be if I were to review it maybe in a month or two. But I have yet to kind of think about what the point of the movie is. So it just doesn't seem like there's much of a message or moral, which is perfectly fine. A movie doesn't have to do that, but that's something that I tend to connect with, and I didn't really see that happening in this. The one thing that I do really like, though, that maybe feeds into this in a way that I hadn't analyzed right away, is that I like how the title Drive is kind of it kind of has two meanings. So it's literally what happens in the movie. It's about a driver. There's a lot of driving in it, but it's also human impulses, and there's a lot of characters acting seemingly irrationally or just solely based on emotion, and that's what their drive is. So I like how there's a little bit of that and the juxtaposition between the two. So maybe I shouldn't have even brought up what's the point. I just haven't really kind of grasped that yet. If anybody has an opinion or an idea on what that is, make sure to tweet us at GSMC_movies. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts. One thing that Nicholas Winding Refn is also known for is sort of having this neon aesthetic. One of his movies is called The Neon Demon. I think that might be the only other one that I've seen from him, which I actually like a lot too. But this one has sort of this neon aesthetic, but also this very warm lighting technique that's used. That's not usually juxtaposed with each other. So this is a film that from the very beginning of the movie, this is sort of production design and cinematography, I guess. It's very clear that it is inspired by, and in a way, a much more modern film noir. So the lighting techniques that are used, the way the framing is used, there's a lot of shadows kind of symbolizing certain things. There's a character who's much more morally gray, but we're still kind of rooting for him. So this is very much film noir, but there's also a much more recent genre that's kind of popularized in the 80s called neo-noir, and then there's also kind of an offshoot of neon noir. So I guess they're not really the same thing. Maybe I'll do a history lesson on that someday if there's a movie that kind of fits into it. But neon noir is kind of what this is. It has this neon aesthetic, but the framing is very similar to the harsh darks and lights of film noir. But then in this, there's a technique of this warm lighting that symbolizes the romance and the intimacy that he has with Carey Mulligan and her son. And then when he has moments that are much darker, literally, or darker emotionally, physically, they're also lit darker literally, and that's a much bluer light. That's kind of where that neon aesthetic comes in. So comparing those two and having both of them function means that those tonal switches don't really feel as jarring, and it's also visually more interesting, and it gives us a cue of what each scene might entail. So I think that's a really effective use of the aesthetic in a way that's not just aesthetic. Like, it also serves the story in a very functional way. And then I can't talk about production design without talking about the jacket. The jacket's very cool. I mean, there's not much I have to talk about it. I just think it really fits the tone of the movie. It has a lot of symbolism involved. It also looks awesome. It's very iconic. It's created a very distinct look for the movie. So just wanted to mention it. I don't really have much to say about it. I just think it's a good job. Well done, production design team. So I kind of mentioned the thing that I liked about the cinematography with the intense lighting cues and the warm colors mixed with the neon aesthetic. So I don't actually have to talk about that as much. I guess that fed from production design. The editing is very slow in the beginning. It lets a lot of these scenes kind of play out. And like I said, it lingers almost too long. So sometimes I'll say that a scene doesn't overstay their welcome. In this one, I think it does, but then it goes far enough that it's very clear that it's intentional, and it makes the audience really sit with what's going on and focus on particularly the ending of a specific scene. But then there are obviously these very jarring cuts, or these very jarring moments of violence, these very violent outbursts. And so having the beginning, I guess a lot of the movie is how the tone of the beginning is set up as much slower, much more methodical, and then that makes these violent moments resonate much more with the audience and much more effective in showing how violent it is to somebody who might not be a part of this world, in a way that I think a lot of other movies don't do. If somebody is a part of the world, we might become desensitized to it in a way, and this movie does not give us that comfort, give us that satisfaction. And another way that it does that is through the sound. I think I was frustrated sometimes because the dialogue was so low. Maybe I would have wanted it to be a little bit higher, but because the dialogue's so low, when we get scenes of rifles firing or the cars starting up, we have to really pay attention to it, and it really kind of like juts us back into the story, and we're like, oh, okay, here we go, time to start really paying attention. And this is like the very important moments, and these are the moments that are supposed to get the audience like into the movie. So I think that's really effective in the way that it's used. And then also, the soundtrack adds so much depth to the story. It's this very like synth pop soundtrack that sometimes might feel out of place, or you might think that it feels out of place because of the darkness of the story, but because of the aesthetic that's already established. And it's kind of in a way an emotional release for this character that doesn't really get any emotional releases unless it's through bashing somebody's head in. So I think the score definitely adds something to the movie, both aesthetically and then, much like the production design, narratively. So then we get into the directing. This is a very well-known director, very well-established and appreciated director. He's not my favorite director, but I really appreciate what he is doing. He knows how to play with emotions of an audience. He knows how to go back and forth between slow and fast without making it feel jarring unless it has to, and then he knows how to make it really jarring. And he lets those moments linger, whether it be a very romantic moment or a violent outburst. So he just has a really solid grasp on how to emotionally manipulate an audience in a way that's both efficient and effective. So I think he does a very good job directing this movie and a lot of his movies. This is kind of his crowning achievement. This is his magnum opus. So I really liked this movie. I didn't like it quite as much as everybody else did, but that's only because everybody loves it. I think I really, really, really like it. So I'm going to give this one a solid 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed Drive. I would recommend going into this with no expectations, like not really knowing what goes on. I tried my best to not spoil what the story is, what any of the shocking moments might be. So if you've already listened to this review and you haven't seen it, I would recommend kind of just going into it now, because I can recommend it. It's on Netflix, so go stream that one as soon as you get the chance, as soon as you put the kids to bed and are ready to watch a violent movie. So that's Drive. Make sure you stay tuned until the next segment where I talk about Baby Driver, and then the final segment where I talk about my top 5 road trip movies of all time. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews for Driveways and Drive. And now, keeping with the word of the day, we're going to go into my weekly recommendation of Baby Driver. And finally, stay tuned until the very end where I talk about my top 5 road trip movies of all time. But right now, it's Baby Driver. And last week, I talked about Hot Fuzz, which is another Edgar Wright movie. So this is Edgar Wright, probably my favorite director, very common favorite director for film school kids these days, but he really does make some, honestly, like, incomprehensible movies of how well made they are. It's really crazy the amount of thought and time and skill that it takes to make these movies. Obviously, that's the case for any movie, but Edgar Wright is on a completely other level. And Baby Driver is no exception. Baby Driver was also kind of the biggest, well, it was definitely his biggest film at the time. And actually, it's his most recent film, so biggest film thus far. But Scott Pilgrim was fairly big. The Cornetto trilogy was big-ish, at least kind of on the latter half. But Baby Driver was this big summer blockbuster. It was marketed as such. Pretty much all of my friends, even the ones who aren't into movies, knew what it was. And so this one, in a sense, kind of feels like the least Edgar Wright-y. It feels a little more studio influence, but even still, there's so much skill in this. And like the talent just pours from every aspect of the movie. So I love this one. It's not my favorite Edgar Wright movie. I still can't believe I haven't talked about Scott Pilgrim. I'm going to do it at some point, but by no means is it like any worse than any of his others. I think it's just up to personal preference. So Baby Driver basically follows Baby, who is another getaway driver. It's actually pretty much the exact same plot as Drive. The getaway driver falls in love with somebody and wants to get out of the crime underworld so she doesn't get hurt. And that's the basic gist of it. But there's a lot of intricacies that are very different than Drive. It's also a very, very, very different tone. I'm going to start this review off by saying I want to kind of not address any of the things that have gone on with the actors now. None of that was known at the time. I do think it might take away some things from watching it. There's a lot of people who are uncomfortable watching movies with people who have been accused of such things, and I totally understand that. If that's not something that you want to support, I totally get it, but I do still love this movie, and I want to review it in a way that is respectful, but I also don't really want to address those things because on the overall holistic sense of the movie, I don't think that it influences the critical analysis nearly as much as it might it might influence your own enjoyment of it. So with that, let's talk about some of the acting. Obviously, the three leads, Lily James, Ansel Elgort, and Kevin Spacey, are all very good in this movie. But actually, I do kind of want to focus on Lily James and Jamie Foxx, because Lily James, this is kind of the first movie that I had seen her in. She has a very charming performance. There's some excellent chemistry between her and Ansel Elgort. I actually think I find her a bit more compelling because of the fact that she has to do so much of the legwork in that early relationship. He's much more laid back, much like Drive. He doesn't say a lot of stuff, and so she kind of has to carry the conversation. But she does so with this real respect to her. She has this kind of like air of confidence throughout the entire movie, and then that kind of gets shattered at a certain point. So I really love her performance, and then I also really like Jamie Foxx. I think Jamie Foxx kills it in almost every role that he has, but this one is just like you never know what he's gonna do. He's so unpredictable. It's fun to watch. It's just kind of this crazy, over the top performance, and I really just like love the intensity and the insanity of his performance. So then the screenplay, many of you probably already know this, but most of the movie was written with all of the songs already in mind. So this movie is driven by the music choices. So there's not really a score in the movie. It's basically the songs that Baby listens to throughout the entire film, and every scene tonally is matched up with the song that he's listening to, but also like literally is in time with the movie. So with the song. So I'll talk about that a little bit more with the editing and stuff, but it's just absolutely insane to me that that's how specific this movie is. But then there's also so many other intricacies of the script. So there's like a ton of ongoing gags or ongoing lines that get repeated, which kind of has this symbolism because he is somebody who samples things. He samples audio and he samples music in his tapes that he makes. And then he also does that in his real life. He samples audio and reuses it somewhere else, telling it to somebody else. So there's just like a lot of actual significance that work on a screenplay level with like callbacks, but then it's also very significant to his life and the themes that have been established throughout the film. The production design isn't quite as overarching as the sounds, like the sound that kind of sustains, or the screenplay, I'm sorry. Whoops, I'm talking about screenplay right now. So it's not as broad where the themes kind of sustain and the callbacks are great in every scene. The production design obviously has a specific look to it, but the use of different colors are kind of different in each scene. There's a really fantastic scene of different primary colors that are used. But what I really like is the use of black and white here. So a lot of the criminals wear solely black, and Baby, when he's not in the criminal world, wears a lot of white. And then when they're together, he has this jacket that is white and black to kind of show the conflict and the two worlds that he's a part of and how he kind of feels about both of them. He's kind of torn between them and wants to go from one to the other. So there's a lot of symbolism with that. And then there's also just some really great aesthetic choices. I think Lily James's costume is really memorable with the light yellow skirt and the jean jacket. I think it's very different than what Baby is wearing, so it stands out. And it's also like with the colors, it's not focused on the moral choices of the black and white, but it's like just a cheery light color, which is kind of what she symbolizes for a lot of the movie. And then my favorite production design choice, which is in the script, and I don't know which came first, Cart of the Horse here, but that's totally not the phrase. That's a completely different phrase. I guess chicken or the egg, it was what I'm trying to say. But the Michael Myers masks are so fun. That's such a good choice. It's also such a funny joke. Like, it's so good. It's very original of a joke, but it's also like kind of an obvious joke. I don't know. It's great. I think it's so funny, and it really, the production design like just lends itself to it. And I don't know which came first, but credits to whoever did that. The cinematography here, there's so many different choices that could have been so much easier. So a lot of the movie's major shots are one takes, or long shots, long takes, and that could have been significantly easier, especially because it's already timed to the music. So that is so difficult to pull off. It's not only difficult to pull off a long take, mind you, but the long take also has to be in time with the music in every movement, every action, every line, every sound cue. So some of those come in editing, but so like the sound cues would probably come in editing, but all of the movements can't be edited out if it's a long take. And so that could have been so much easier on Edgar Wright and the entire team if they had wanted to do different cuts. but it just makes it look that much more visually interesting. We get to follow Baby. We get to actually like spend some time with him. And so the fact that there's so much effort put into this really, really pays off. And then with the editing, I'm going to start, before I get into the sound and the music, I'm going to start with, I love match cuts, and there's a couple of them in here, and most of them are done somewhat practically. Obviously, the digital rendering is going to make it look a little bit better, but I think the match cuts just look great, and that's both cinematography and the editing, so I just wanted to get that out of the way. If you like match cuts, that's also something that's very impressive. But like I said, everything is timed with the music, and a lot of that are sound cues or actual cuts. So the first scene is this 6-minute heist scene with no dialogue, and it's gorgeous, first of all. It's one of the best car chase scenes in any movie ever. It shows off the skill that Baby has, and the editing, whether it be certain sound cues or different cuts, especially in the beginning of that scene, are timed for the music. So we get to hear Baby, like, or not hear him, but we get to see him like lip syncing. But then we also get to see the cuts as they pertain to each other character in the movie. But then the one that's more impressive, where there's that long take, like I said, that's next, when he's walking to go get coffee, which I think is even more impressive. And then the most impressive comes in the editing, both sound editing and actual cuts. It comes towards the end of the second act where they go to get guns, and there's a huge gunfight in a warehouse, and every shot, like literally every physical shot of the camera and every shot of a gun is timed to the music, and it is insane. It's gorgeous. It's so visually pleasing. It just works on every level, and the editing is so quick and jarring that it just complements the music in such a nice way. And then we get to the music. The soundtrack is perfect. I think people mostly talk about how well it's timed to the movie, but I also really like how each theme is expressed through the music. So each scene has something to do, or each song has something to do with the scene. And so in that way, it's also really specific and on the nose, which for a movie like this, that's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but also kind of serious, I think that really works. And then I'm not going to talk too much about the directing, just because I mentioned him last week, and I mostly talked about what he did there, but he just has so much fun doing his movies, but he also, you can tell how much work he puts into it. So he's just my favorite director. I absolutely adore this guy. And here's a little fun fact about Baby Driver that I will mention. So this movie came out roughly around the same time as Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 came out, and Edgar Wright and James Gunn are friends, and they knew that they both were making this movie that had a lot of kind of older songs, or songs that were very specific to the movie, because obviously music plays a very large role in the narrative arc of Peter Quill in the Guardians movies. So they were actually in correspondence to make sure that neither of them had repeat songs. So one didn't appear on the other's movie, so it wouldn't necessarily ruin the feeling of each other's scenes, which I think is just like very cool, very cute. So I wanted to mention that, but I love Baby Driver. It is not one of my favorite movies, but it is one of my favorite Edgar Wright movies, because I think all of his movies are just so excellent and brilliant. So Baby Driver, I'm going to give this one a soft 9 out of 10. Absolutely excellent. Go check it out if you haven't already seen it. But that's Baby Driver. And so those are the movies for the day. Those are the drive-based movies. But make sure you stick around for the next segment, the final segment, where I talk about my favorite road trip movies of all time. But right now we're going to take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of Driveways, Drive, and Baby Driver. You might be sensing a little bit of a motif here. And we're going to keep that trend going and talk about my top 5 road trip movies of all time. This was a very difficult list to make. I thought it would be a lot easier to find road trip movies, but there are not a ton of movies that, I guess there's a good amount of movies that involve a road trip, but not all of them are that good, or they're not ones that I've seen. So this was kind of a difficult list to come up with, but because of that, we're going to run through this list probably a little bit quicker than we normally do, because they're not necessarily like my favorite movies ever. I think I probably would only put the top 3 in my like weekly recommendation list, but I do really still enjoy the bottom 2, but you know what? Let's just start talking about it. So my number 5 is Pee-wee's Big Adventure. I was a big fan of Pee-wee growing up. We had like a box set. We had a disc set, DVD set of like a lot of the early episodes of Pee-wee's Playhouse. And so I've always really liked that character, that world, and I like how this movie just kind of like expands upon it. We get to see him outside of his comfort zone, outside of the house, and there's also just like some really fun family friendly moments in this movie that just have some great comedy in them. It's just overall like a very fun movie, and I wonder how well it works for somebody who didn't like enjoy the show, because the show's just like very strange, it's kind of weird, and so the movie is also kind of like that, but there are a lot of kids movies that kind of follow the same vein. So this is definitely a fun movie to watch with the family. Show to some of your younger siblings if you have them, some young cousins, put it on in the background. I think this is just a super fun movie, and the road trip is a very big element of it. So that's number 5. Number 4 is a newer movie, one that I was very surprised by how much I liked it, and that one is Toy Story 4. So Toy Story 4 is a road trip movie. A lot of it takes place in one environment, but it is about traveling, going on a road trip. All of the characters kind of go through it together, and so you get that sort of mini subgenre. But then also, this is just like a really nice send-off to some of these characters. I'm definitely of the opinion that it didn't need to happen. Toy Story 3 is a really great finale for these characters, but I really liked the additions that they had. Gabby Gabby is a really intriguing villain. I would say probably even more intriguing than some of the other ones in the Toy Story movies. I didn't find Forky nearly as obnoxious as I thought that I would. I think he's actually a very fun character, and I really enjoyed him in the movie. The ventriloquist dolls are absolutely terrifying, especially if you're a fan of Goosebumps, because it's the same look as the Night of the Living Dummy, and I absolutely hated that. But I did really enjoy this movie. I think it's very heartfelt. It's got, obviously, that Pixar charm to it, and it pulls at your heartstrings. You're so familiar with these characters, and it's just a really nice way to conclude this story. Hopefully. I hope it's concluded. I hope it's done. Okay, so number 3 is a movie that probably won't be on most people's lists, because it's hard to know whether it's like a road trip movie, whether it falls under that category. But the entire movie takes place in a car, so I would count it. It's definitely on the road for that amount of time. On the road longer than most road trip movies are. So this one is called Locke. This is a movie that stars Tom Hardy, and it's basically just him in a car for like an hour and a half. And somehow I never got bored. It's so compelling. I haven't seen this one in a long time, so I actually can't like describe sort of the intricacies of the story as well as I could if I'd seen it more recently. But his performance is just so captivating, and he gets to like act by himself with kind of a little bit of a monologue, and then he also gets to talk to people on the phone, so you get what the story is about. It's on him the entire time, so he couldn't break. And there's some minimal cuts in here, obviously, to get a little bit more pacing issues out of the way, but it really feels like a stage play in a way, and it just works extremely well, and is way more interesting and compelling than I ever would have expected. So I really, really love Locke. I think it's super underrated, and that's why it's at number 3. Number 2 would probably be at the top of most people's list as road trip movies. I think it is the epitome of what makes a really good road trip movie. It is extremely smart comedy, great chemistry, has some excellent heartfelt moments, and that is Little Miss Sunshine. I saw this one recently. I hadn't seen it before. I had been highly anticipating it, and actually I think I might have seen it during quarantine. Maybe I didn't. I don't remember. But it's an excellent comedy. It's got a powerhouse cast. Everyone delivers such a great performance that has the ups and downs of being in a family. There's so many like issues addressed of what it is to be in a family dynamic, what it is to have a life outside of the family, what it is to be like isolated from your family. And then it has just like the perfect mix of dumb comedy, but then like also really smart and somewhat edgy jokes. So I think this is such a well-conceived comedy. It's also a great road trip movie because of how integral to the story that is, and that's why it's number 2. So number 1, I don't really know if it counts. So if it doesn't count, then Little Miss Sunshine is number 1. But my number 1 movie is another Pixar movie that serves the same function as a road trip movie and feels very, very similar, even if it doesn't take place on the road, and that one is Finding Nemo. So I would totally classify Finding Nemo as a road trip movie. It follows a lot of the same tropes. It entails a journey of going from one place to the other with a given destination. There's a partner dynamic with Dory and Marlin. We also get the side story of Nemo, and even that kind of has a little bit of road trip vibes towards the end of the movie. And this one is my favorite Pixar movie. I think this one just has so much packed into such a seemingly small story, and the visuals are absolutely gorgeous. So I'm sorry if you were expecting Cars when I said Pixar, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. I just think Finding Nemo is an excellent movie, and I wanted to put a movie that I really adore. This is in like my top 20, 25, so I wanted to put that in the list since this is a little bit of a weaker list than normal, and I really do think it serves a lot of the same conventions and functions as a road trip movie, and that's why it's number 1. I would love to hear your guys' list, though. There are not a lot of road trip movies that I have seen, ultimately, and so I wanted to pick the ones that I had, obviously, and the ones that I enjoyed the most. And I did have fun making this list, even though it was a bit more difficult than I expected. But that's today's episode. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I would love to hear some of your feedback, some movies that you might recommend. So you can tweet us at GSMC_movies. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to remind you to please subscribe to the show if you haven't already. And also, if you could leave us a nice review, because that really helps us. And if you could follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you so much, and have a good one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.